Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. We've received a number of questions about the funeral procession and the commemoration of Sayyid Ali Khamenei, and inshallah we'll use this opportunity to address a number of those questions.
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Over the past few days, we've seen spectacular images coming out of Iran with large numbers of people at the funeral processions. There are estimates of 9 or 12 million people in Iran and millions more in Iraq, which would make it perhaps one of the largest or the single largest funeral procession in history. What is leading to such a large number of people feeling that kind of emotion to come out to these funeral processions in different countries and in extreme heat and the circumstances as they are?
Certainly in the West, but even perhaps many people within the region and within Iran who expected it to be a well-attended funeral may not have expected this level of popular presence and emotion. And there's a number of factors. First, and perhaps most obviously, we are in the month of Muharram, which is a month when many Muslims, particularly Shi'i Muslims, commemorate the martyrdom of Imam Hussein, the grandson of Prophet Muhammad. May God's peace and blessings be with both of them. And that is a story of a courageous individual, the grandson of the Prophet, the Imam, according to the belief of Shi'i Muslims, standing up to the oppressive and tyrannical and not only unjust but anti-Islamic government of Yazid. So that story resonates both in terms of the tragedy and in terms of some of the specific circumstances. Imam Hussein was martyred with a small band of loyal companions and with his family, including a very young child, a 6-month-old child that died in his arms. Sayyid Khamenei also was assassinated at his home, not during a war, but during a period when ostensibly Iran and America were engaged in negotiations. And most of the news reports at the time said that the negotiations were proceeding in a constructive atmosphere. So for many Muslims and for many people throughout the world, that attack on Sayyid Khamenei, which killed his daughter, his granddaughter, the same day there was an attack on a children's school in Minab, Iran, that killed more than 100 young students. That resonated with the story of Karbala, both in terms of the tragedy and in terms of the resolute stance against a tyrannical government. But then there's some other aspects as well. One is that for many Iranians, the last few centuries have represented a period of domination by great powers throughout the world, especially in the 19th and 20th century. Iran, which has been proud of its imperial past, its civilization and culture, has often felt that they have been looked down upon by Imperial Russia, Great Britain, the United States. And so for many people who may not identify with Sayyid Khamenei's religious message, or even with the broader message of resistance to the United States or to imperialism, he is being seen as a symbol of Iranian sovereignty and dignity. And then beyond Iran, beyond Shi'i Muslims or Muslims in general, there is an increasing recognition that there is something rotten in the way that the affairs of the world run. The world has witnessed a genocide in Palestine, and particularly in Gaza, with very little effective response. Perhaps there have been boycotts of certain companies, there have been rallies and publicity campaigns, there has been a case in the International Court of Justice. None of these will be felt by many people to be effective sources of resistance. Sayyid Khamenei's message was much more decisive, that the people of the world, and particularly Muslims, need to stand up and fight back, and not just symbolically join a protest or boycott a company or file a case at the United Nations or the International Court of Justice, but actually fight fire with fire and take one's rights and one's dignity. That's a message that resonates with many religious Muslims. It resonates with many people who identify with the story of resistance and feel that the international system is unjust towards indigenous people, towards oppressed people. And it resonates particularly within Iran, even with some people who are coming from a national or a patriotic position and not necessarily from a religious framework.
Beyond his being a symbol of resistance, is there something unique about him individually as a person that can help us better understand why there is such a large outpouring of grief at his assassination? Is it his interests, his background, his family? Is it just representation or a symbol of resistance, or is there something about him that's unique among world leaders and religious scholars?
It wasn't just that he was a symbol of resistance to occupation or to imperialism. Sayyid Khamenei was unique among senior Shi'i religious clergy in a number of ways. First of all, he had a wide interest in literature. An interest in Persian and Arabic poetry and literature, particularly mystical poetry, is not unusual within the seminary. But Sayyid Khamenei had a broader interest in fiction, in novels. He had read Victor Hugo. He had recommended that people read Les Miserables. And his framework was one of a universal message that was rooted in the theology and the history of Islam, but that also spoke beyond a purely Muslim framework or audience. He was an expert, for example, in the Persian poetry of Muhammad Iqbal. Muhammad Iqbal is often considered to be the inspiration behind the movement for the creation of an independent state of Pakistan, even though he died years before Pakistan gained independence from England. So that's one aspect of this, the interests of Sayyid Khamenei that moves beyond just the traditional culture or expectations of a Shi'i scholar. Another element that was also somewhat unique is his pan-Islamic interest, particularly in the political and in the cultural unity of the Muslim world. He had read Hassan al-Banna, the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood, Al-Ikhwan al-Muslimun. He had translated the commentary of Quran written by Sayyid Qutb, Fi Dhilal al-Quran. So his pan-Islamic interest, which is reflected in his leadership, in some of his religious rulings that may have been somewhat controversial to more traditional Shi'i Muslims, is part of his broader appeal. And so he had an appeal to many Shi'i Muslims, to Muslims beyond the Shi'i school of law and theology, and also to people who identified with his message of resistance to oppression.
Were any of these interests that you're mentioning, for example, the literary interest in Western and in Eastern literature or his post-sectarian thought, were these rooted in existing tradition, or were these something unique in Sayyid Khamenei?
Certainly the interest in mystical poetry and even the political activism, particularly the emphasis on pan-Islamic unity and on independence from foreign influence and domination, these are trends that existed within the Shi'i seminary. They were not unusual. What is somewhat unusual is the way that the religious leadership of Sayyid Khamenei developed. So to understand that, we have to understand his predecessor, the founder of the Islamic Revolution, Imam Khomeini. Imam Khomeini became a religious authority, what's known as a marji' taqlid, organically, through the normal process of teaching within the seminary and becoming widely recognized as one of the senior-most figures within the seminary. And his political role and administrative role within the revolution after its success, it derived from that organic position. So to understand the hierarchy of the Shi'i seminary, and it's not a formalized hierarchy, the first level of senior scholarship is what we call ijtihad, where a person has the knowledge of the basic areas of Islamic sciences and is qualified to derive an independent opinion in Islamic law. That person is called a mujtahid. But it's like a person who's just freshly graduated from medical school or professional school. They have not yet exercised their knowledge. They're just theoretically qualified. The next stage would be to begin to practice medicine or law, to begin to exercise their expertise. And that is called a mujtahid mutajazzi, a partial mujtahid. In one or two areas of law, they have actually done their research, they have derived an independent opinion. The next stage is where a person has taught and exercised their legal reasoning in all areas of Islamic law, and now they are a comprehensive senior Islamic scholar, what's called a mujtahid mutlaq, an absolute jurist, or somebody who has an independent opinion within Islamic religious law in all areas of law. And then a fourth stage is the senior most figures who have that qualification. There might be hundreds of people who are mujtahids, who have the qualifications and have exercised their judgment in different areas of law, but generally there are only 3 or 4 people who are at that top tier of Islamic scholarship. Imam Khamenei was one of those top tier scholars, and that's what gave him the social and religious legitimacy and credibility to lead the movement to overthrow the Shah and to establish the new government in Iran after the success of the revolution. Then his role was formalized within the constitutional framework of Iran. For Sayyid Khamenei, he was a scholar, but not at that level of seniority. And he was about 40 some years of age when the revolution succeeded. He entered into administrative roles within the Assembly of Experts as the president of Iran. And through his governmental and administrative roles, he acquired a familiarity with the needs and exigencies of governing a country. And then he was elevated to the position of the leader of Iran after the death of Imam Khomeini. So his role as a senior cleric, as a source of religious authority where people would follow his religious rulings in Islamic law, that in some sense derived from his administrative and his governmental position. That was a unique position within Islamic law, within Islamic history. It was controversial. It's partially a reflection of the fact that what had been an organic process within the Shi'i Muslim seminary was now being formalized into a constitutional and a state framework. And so that is the natural evolution of the position of a Shi'i Muslim jurist whose authority before the revolution in Iran was informal and social, and now was becoming part of, or had become part of, a state apparatus.
Did he have a generally similar worldview to Imam Khomeini? Was his perspective on Wilayat al-Faqih, the role of the Islamic government, one-to-one to what Imam Khomeini believed, or was there differences and back and forths?
There was certainly some back and forth. After the revolution, one of the discussions that existed within the seminary was how can this new government function? One opinion is that classical Islamic law should be the basis of legislation and government policy. Now, this is something that it's very difficult, perhaps impossible, to govern a modern country with its diversity and its complexity on the basis of classical rulings. So, for example, according to this opinion, whatever Islam says about the permissibility of music or forms of entertainment or art, taxation, all of those should be applied as foreseen within Islamic law, as classically formulated. The age of marriage for men and women, for example. There should be no taxation other than the zakat and khums that exists within classical Islamic law. Now, a modern country, the population has expectations. for the government to support and subsidize education, health insurance, social security for the elderly, and also to establish infrastructure, bridges, public transportation, educational institutions, and to industrialize the country, to establish a defense industry and a military that can protect the country and its sovereignty and defend it in the case of aggression. The limited financial sources and ability to legislate within classical Islamic law would not permit a modern state to function with all of the needs and expectations that it would have. One response from within the seminary was to say that, well, classical Islamic law has primary rulings and then secondary rulings that apply in cases of emergency. So for example, the primary ruling is that to consume pork is prohibited. But if a person is starving, they are permitted to consume pork in order to save their life. Similarly, to take a loan at interest is prohibited. But an individual or a country, if it needs that loan in order to prevent economic collapse, would be permitted to take that interest loan. So one response within the seminary was that the framework of Islamic law will be what governs Iran after the revolution. And that was the opinion taken by Sayyid Khamenei in one of his Friday sermons. Imam Khomeini gave a very decisive rebuke to that position. And in effect, what Imam Khomeini was saying is that based on this view, the Islamic government will always be in a reactive position. It's going to only legislate such policies for the economy, for social policies, for defense, when there is an emergency. So for example, in classical Islamic law, two people are free to enter into an employment contract. There is no minimum wage. There is no maximum number of hours that a person can be employed for. There is no requirement of paid time off, of the employer providing insurance or a pension or worker safety. It's a free negotiation between two individuals that a government does not oversee. Imam Khomeini's response was that in a modern state, the leader, the wali faqih, the Muslim jurist, has to have a broader ability to not just reactively, but proactively legislate to meet the expectations and the needs of society and the interests and the expectations of the population. So at the time of the revolution, this was a very new discussion within the seminary. Now, over the last few decades, these are discussions that take place, and Iran has established a number of constitutional bodies to allow for legislation to be evaluated in terms of the Islamic requirements. There is a guardian council that vets the Islamic validity of legislation, and an expediency council that adjudicates if there is a dispute between the legislature and the guardian council about whether a particular piece of legislation is Islamically valid or not.
How does that tie into Iranian intervention in the conflict in Syria post-2011 with their defense of the government of Bashar al-Assad?
So that was a very controversial intervention, not only in the broader Muslim world, but even within Iran. And certainly it deserves to be questioned and critiqued, but it shouldn't be caricatured. So some people have seen it as a sectarian intervention. Some people have seen it as a Persian invasion of Arab lands. Both of those are inaccurate. From the Iranian perspective, there wasn't a kind of sympathy for the Ba'ath government. The government of Syria is the Ba'ath party, which is an Arab nationalist political party that ruled in different branches in Iraq and in Syria. And because it was a secular Arab nationalist party. In both countries, it went against the sentiments of the majority of the population because both Syria and Iraq are largely Muslim countries who would expect their government to also reflect their religious values and sentiments. And in both countries, there has been authoritarianism and a number of serious human rights violations. But unlike what many people might view Syria as, from the Iranian perspective, Syria was not a uniquely authoritarian or tyrannical government. If the Syrian government attacked its citizens in Hama in 1982, Jordan had the Black September massacre of 1970. Saudi Arabia, the government of Ali Abdullah Saleh in Yemen, Saddam Hussein, other governments within the region and within the Muslim world also had various massacres, human rights violations, and of course Iran itself had a number of issues both before and after the revolution. So Iran's logic was that there is a greater enemy, which is the external imperialism, colonialism, neocolonialism, and occupation of Muslim lands. The fact that European powers and America want to assert their military and economic primacy in Muslim lands. The higher priority is to fight that external aggression, and then, once Muslims have regained their sovereignty, these internal affairs can be dealt with among Muslims, whether it be in Syria or Iraq or Egypt or Yemen or elsewhere. So from the Iranian perspective, and again, this is an opinion that was debated within Iran and even after the fall of Bashar Assad's government, it is fair game to question and to critique. The Iranian calculation, however, was not that we want to spread Shiism. It was not that we want to spread Persian language or culture. Iran has supported the PLO, it has supported the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, it has supported Hamas. Iran's logic was, we want to support any group that is allied against the Israeli occupation and against the forces of what it calls al-istikbar al-alami, global arrogance, imperialism and neo-imperialism. The opposition to Bashar Assad was supported by Turkey, a NATO power, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Emirates, Bahrain, Jordan, all allies of the United States, hosts of US military bases, and parts of the Western and Israeli security architecture within the Middle East. Now, these countries supported different groups, but they were allied against Bashar Assad. Bashar had not fought Israel actively, but he was a conduit of support for the resistance. So from the Iranian calculation, it was about the primacy of that external enemy. The question does come up that, well, what about Iraq and Afghanistan? Because Iran cooperated with America on some level in its invasion of both Iraq and Afghanistan. And here as well, from the Iranian perspective, Saddam Hussein was not an enemy of the United States. He had fought an 8-year war with Iran with Western support and with the support of the United States allies in West Asia, the Arab countries of the Persian Gulf. And the Taliban also were the successors of the Mujahideen that had fought Soviet Russia, Soviet Union, with American and Pakistani support. So in general, the orientation of Iranian foreign policy was to support the removal of foreign powers, particularly Western powers, and their military bases from Islamic lands. And that was the logic by which they prioritized the fight against Israel over the internal reform of Syria or other Islamic countries.
We've touched on a lot of the areas that bring up a lot of the controversy surrounding Iran and his leadership of Iran. But in the past few days, we've seen at least 10 million people coming out in the streets of Iran and several million more in Iraq. Is that just because what he did aged well? Is it because he's been assassinated by clear enemies after we've seen the genocide in Gaza and in Palestine, so that he's being seen with rose-tinted glasses? What is the legacy that we're seeing that we have to understand?
Some of the opinions that he has expressed probably have aged well, and a number of people, especially within Iran, have said that we've reconsidered some of our opposition, particularly with regard to his emphasis on sovereignty, on defense, with his portrayal of the enemy, what some people popularly call the Epstein coalition, as degenerate and as rapacious and unworthy of negotiation, incapable of reaching an agreement. So there is that element. But many of those same people will say that we still have a very serious opposition to some of his domestic policies and politics, in the economy, and in many other areas. So part of it is that certain aspects of his message are resonating with people, and they may reconsider their own past opposition. Part of it is that many people in Iran and throughout the region, throughout the Muslim world, and even beyond the Muslim world, admire a person who believes something so strongly that they are willing to give their life for it, knowing the threat of assassination, not to back down and compromise, not to hide and protect their life. So that courage is something that resonates even beyond necessarily agreeing with the details of specific policies. And that's an important thing for people in the West and in the United States to understand. There is a logic of martyrdom that is very meaningful for many Muslims, which is perhaps difficult for somebody that doesn't come from a religious framework to understand. Very famously, when Israel killed Yahya Sinwar, they published the video of his final moments, where he is wounded in a destroyed building, and in a final symbolic, perhaps desperate act of resistance, he throws a stick towards a drone that was coming to assassinate him. The Israelis, in publishing that, probably said that this is going to show how utterly defeated he is. But when that was published, it had the exact opposite effect. For many people, it became a symbol of courage, of resistance, of an undefeatable will to stand up for one's rights. It might have inspired many more people to follow in the footsteps of Yahya Sinwar. So for Sayyid Khamenei, there will be an ongoing evaluation of some of his priorities, some of the things that the jury might still be out about right now. They will be reevaluated positively or negatively. Right now, many analysts in the West, in Iran, are saying that Iran has the upper hand in the latest war. That evaluation in military terms or economic terms might change in the next few weeks and months. And then maybe it'll change multiple times in the coming years. But what will remain is a story that for many people is very meaningful and very inspiring, of courage, of dignity, of resistance, of sovereignty. And for many Americans, I think it's important to evaluate, why is it that so many Muslims in West Asia and the Islamic world, so many people may have objections towards the United States. Some people say, they hate us for our freedom. Whereas for many Iranians in this funeral, even as they have spoken about the need for revenge. They have said explicitly that we have nothing against the American people. We have something against a government that attacked us and that wishes to overpower us. Is that battle inevitable? Well, if we don't understand the beliefs and the values, the religion, the symbolism of people in other countries, followers of other religions, then conflict will be inevitable. If we have a greater understanding and a sympathy for their values and their dignity, then it is entirely possible for that conflict to be resolved amicably.
A couple of months ago, after the assassination of Sayyid Ali Khamenei, the Assembly of Experts elected Sayyid Mujtaba Khamenei, his son, as his successor and the supreme leader of Iran. And for many people, he's a relatively unknown person with perhaps a more background role. And so there's a questioning of his religious authority and his capabilities as a leader. Is this just a repetition of the doubts and the questions that his father faced several decades earlier, or is this a new and a unique situation?
The circumstances of his election were certainly unique. It was under security threat, a very difficult meeting of the Assembly of Experts because there was the present threat of a follow-up attack. I think the main message that the Assembly of Experts gave with that selection is continuity. Trump had said that we have effected regime change. We have eliminated the top echelon of Iranian political, religious, and military leadership. We have new faces. We're going to have a new agreement and new policies. And so part of the response and resistance to that was for Iran to say that we have continuity. And Sayyid Mujtaba Khamenei represents that continuity not only in terms of being the son of his father and an active member of his household and in the background of carrying out his governance and his policies, but also of being very close to the security and military establishment. So Sayyid Khamenei himself, during the Iran-Iraq War, was known as being very close to the soldiers and the generals on the battlefield. And his son also volunteered in the Iran-Iraq War, maintained that kind of a closeness with the military and the security officials and with the Iranian allies, the so-called axis of resistance in the broader region. So the primary message is one of continuity. Sayyid Mujtaba Khamenei has also not had a public administrative role in the way that his father did in the earlier days of the revolution. He was known as being a well-respected seminarian and scholar. He's taught the highest level of fiqh or Islamic law. So in some ways, he is more recognized as a seminarian and a religious scholar than his father was at the time of his appointment as a leader. But what his leadership means for the future of Iranian policies, what will change and what will stay the same in domestic policy in terms of politics and economy, in terms of fighting corruption and other important issues that many Iranians have a great interest in within the country, and also what it will mean in terms of his religious authority. Is he going to issue religious edicts and become recognized as a religious authority for people to refer to the legal opinions of or not? Those are things that we cannot predict at this time. What we can say is that more than anything else, it represents a continuity with the top level priorities that Sayyid Khamenei had established during his lifetime, during the 37 years of his position of leadership within the Iranian system.
Speaking of religious authorities, what is the procedure for those who followed Sayyid Ali Khamenei as their marja taqlid, and what should they do now that he's been assassinated? Is there a procedure for switching one's marja taqlid? What should be done?
A marja taqlid is a religious scholar that a practicing Shi'i Muslim refers to understand how to practice their religion. And that has to be one of the living scholars at the top tier of religious scholarship. When that religious authority dies, the procedure is the same regardless of who it might be, whether it was Sayyid Khamenei or another person that doesn't have a governmental position. And that is that you refer to other scholars and experts and determine who is the most learned living scholar, or if there are a number of people who are of approximately equal scholarship, or it's not possible to determine one person as the most qualified and learned, then you follow any one of those people at the top tier. Either you can follow the rulings of that new religious scholar, or you can ask them, am I permitted to continue practicing according to the religious edicts of the scholar that I had followed in the past? So you must refer to a living scholar, either to refer to their rulings, or with their permission to continue to follow some or all of the rulings of the previous scholar who is now deceased.
Why was there such a delay for his burial and funeral? Is that permitted in Islamic law? And why is the body being taken to so many cities internationally as well before being buried?
It is highly recommended in Islamic law to bury the body as soon as possible after burial. But according to Shi'i Islamic law, that is not a categorical requirement. It is permissible to delay the burial if it will not lead to disrespect of the body, and if there is a greater interest in delaying the burial, such as for family members to arrive and participate in the prayer or in the burial, if there is a will that the deceased has made to be buried in a certain place, or if there is a security concern that would prevent a funeral or a burial. In the case of Sayyid Khamenei, the primary consideration was probably that for many of his followers and people who believed in his message of resistance, his death represents not just an assassination, but a martyrdom. And for them to participate in his funeral not only is to offer their prayers and their respects, but to support and to strengthen that path and message of resistance to which he devoted his life and for which he gave his life. And that can be seen as a more important consideration than the recommendation to bury the body as soon as possible. It's not a categorical requirement, it is a recommendation, and there are other considerations that can affect how soon the body is buried.
To wrap up this conversation, when we see the funeral procession for Sayyid Khamenei, what are the things that we should be keeping in mind?
There's a number of messages that we can take away from this funeral and this commemoration of the death of Sayyid Ali Khamenei. For those who may not be Muslims and have no personal or religious connection to West Asia or to the Muslim world, it's important to see the people who are grieving and commemorating the death of Sayyid Ali Khamenei not as adversaries, but as fellow human beings, and to try to understand what it is that their sentiments and their values are. Often in politics and the media, we caricature people as intractable enemies, when in reality, they might not have any animosity towards us. They may simply feel that they are aggrieved and that our policies or our governments have taken away their rights or are in the process of fighting them and their dignity and their rights. For Muslims, it's a reminder that we don't believe in a purely material logic. In the current atmosphere where there is an ongoing aggression against not only Palestine, but a greater Israel project to dominate Muslim lands as a whole and to divide and conquer Muslims. it's important for Muslims to develop a pan-Islamic sentiment, regardless of their opinion about some of the specific opinions and decisions of Sayyid Ali Khamenei. There is a universal message in the events that we are seeing today that I think all human beings can learn from.